Why all D&D religions and your cleric should probably be lawful. Today on Dungeon Craft.
And today on Under Dice, we see why this take is a load of awful propaganda. Because I use my reaction. Okay, so you'll find a link to the original video down below. So I'll just point out one thing. Throughout his whole video, Professor Dungeon Master never defines lawful or chaotic. So let's start with that. In the Player's Handbook at page 122, chaotic good is defined as creatures act as their conscience directs with little regard for what others expect. Chaotic neutral. Creatures follow their whims, holding their personal freedom above all else. And chaotic evil creatures act with arbitrary violence spurred by their greed, hatred, or bloodlust. They're not actually defined by themselves, they're defined by how they're perceived by other people. That's not very useful to define somebody only by their perception by other people. We're not talking about their actions here, we're not talking about themselves, we're only talking about how they're perceived. Does that mean that a chaotic character is only chaotic within some societies? If you pick him in another society, he suddenly stops being chaotic? Well, this interpretation of alignment definitely says so. And it's not just chaotic. Look at lawful. Lawful good. Creatures can be counted on to do the right thing as expected by society. As expected by society. That means a lawful good character is only lawful good depending on their society. Okay, this is a problem. That means that these definitions of alignment are fully dependent on the society. Do you want to play a chaotic good character? Well, okay. I hope that your vision of your character fits what chaotic good means in my world. Oh, you wanted to play lawful good character? Well, I hope you didn't choose on a personality before knowing what my world was. No, this is a definitional problem, and I believe this goes back to a very old problem in alignment, which if we go here on Dungeons and Dragons fandom.com, we have Tim Cakes, a quote from Tim Cakes, an employee of TSR. As originally conceived, lawful meant that you were a creature of habits, not that you wore a badge. You could be predicted to react in a familiar way given a familiar situation time and time again. You weren't a kender or an elf who was constantly flitting off. Okay, that's chaotic. The personality that can't focus or won't focus on something, you literally have no idea how they're likely to react or at any given provocation. Even if they reacted one way before, they might react a different way. That's chaotic. But this notion of chaotic is very problematic because it is not a definition based from within, it is an othering definition. Now, if you look at the definition of lawful, it's basically, hey, this is a rational person that you can expect to behave in a consistent way. And chaotic is, you don't know what's going to come out of these people. But just because you can't tell how somebody's going to react because you don't understand their internal logic does not mean that that internal logic doesn't exist. And have you thought maybe the person that you can't understand their internal logic looks at you and doesn't understand you and think that you have no internal logic? Now, if you know any autistic people, if you are autistic, what I just described is your daily life, isn't it? This definition of chaotic basically just to put people with internal logic that are minority within your society and others them and puts on them a label that supposedly isn't compatible with order, with society. This kind of definition, this style of definition, is othering and is harmful. Based on this definition, I think it's pretty obvious that chaotic as an alignment isn't axiomatic. It's arbitrary from the position of the dominant in society. But even lawful people, what are they defined by? Laws of society, customs of society, not a moral axiom. So that means that even lawful isn't objective. It is relative to a place and time. So that means that chaotic is relative to them. It is not just arbitrary, it is arbitrary to that dominant structure. In other words, chaotic is defined as lawful propaganda. And when you view it that way, of course, anything that's good for society will have to be defined as lawful.
The player's handbook, it clearly states most adventuring clerics maintain some connection to established temples and orders of their faiths. A temple might ask for a cleric's aid, or a high priest might be in a position to demand it. If you belong to a hierarchy and an order, you are the definition of lawful. And rules lawyers, don't hang your case on the words most and might. They mean if the DM feels like it. That's why DM stands for Dungeon Master and not Dungeon Moderator.
Hierarchies. This is something that can be axiomatized and can be built from. Linda Page. I was at Summerfest many years ago. It was Britain's biggest LARP gathering. The biggest group there was the Chaos Guild. It had a spokesperson. They didn't seem to see the irony nor the contradiction. Which begs the question, does organization imply hierarchy, which implies being lawful? If so, where do you draw the line? Is any group organization by definition lawful? Then isn't chaotic non-existent at that point? Where do you draw the line at that point? Well, I believe that there's one ideology that can be very insightful to us here. And this is a decision that we could say is self-defining. Because who could we attribute the label of chaotic more than to anarchists? One has to wonder, why was the Chaos Guild spokesperson called a spokesperson and not the leader? This sounds like a weird question, right? Well, if you're in anarchist circles, this makes all the difference in the world. Let's take, for example, Québec Solidaire, which is a political party in my province of Canada, Quebec. Now, Québec Solidaire doesn't have party leaders. Well, it technically does. There's one person who's named the party leader on the official government paper, but that person is not elected. It does not serve in our chamber. It just because by the bylaws of the party, that person is basically a secretary that's a paper pusher. Because the party refused to have a leader. It does have two quote-unquote leaders, which are called spokesperson. And the reason that they're called spokesperson is because the idea that they're above the rest of the party is explicitly rejected. And the reason that there are two is the same. One must not be able to quell the power behind them. That doesn't mean that there's no organization. It just means that who the quote-unquote leaders are legitimized from the bottom up rather than from divine or legal authority of above to below. This nature of the hierarchy is how we can define chaotic in a useful way for our games. Professor Dungeon Master does give the example of the relation between the Catholic Church and the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire. Okay, that's very hierarchical. But what about Martin Luther and his approach to religion? This idea that no, you cannot go top-down authority, that everybody has to have a direct relationship with God. Now, you might say that this is organized, but most Protestant churches, the pastor is just one person among them. Now, that might be more organized than some pagan groups, but are you going to really put people like Protestants in the same box as the Catholic Church? then isn't this lawful umbrella way too big? So should all religions and cleric be lawful? Well, does every god want a top-down approach? Does every religion work from a top-down approach? No. Plenty of religions throughout history have been about a direct relationship between a god and the individual. They have been, even their priests have been more like philosophers and basically public speakers that were good at convincing people rather than having authority over others. What makes the hierarchy? This is the point we need to look at. Not just whether there's an organization, is how those organizations are justified. If you want to play a chaotic priest, make Martin Luther proud.